There is a sound the jungle makes when it is safe. Cicadas layered over each other in their thousands, the calls of unseen birds, the small, ceaseless rustle of a living forest doing what it has always done. And there is a moment, known to a particular kind of soldier, when all of it stops at once. Not fades. Stops. In that silence, a patrol of 5 Australians would already be motionless, because they had stopped before the forest did, because the man at the front had felt the thing coming before there was anything yet to hear. No device had told him. No manual had described it. It was the one skill the Australian Army could never teach, and it helped make these men the most feared hunters of the entire war, soldiers. The enemy came to call Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. Across more than 1,000 patrols deep inside the enemy's own country, they lost a single man, killed outright in the fighting. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the phantoms of the jungle before today? Because what you are about to learn was kept out of the war the cameras showed you. Now let us go. To understand the thing these men did that no instructor could ever reduce to a lesson, you must first understand the war that Australia chose to fight, because it wasn't the war the world remembers. The picture that has survived is an American one. Vast sweeps of infantry lifted into landing zones by clattering waves of helicopters. The search and destroy operation built on a single promise, that if you could only force the enemy to stand and fight, you would destroy him with a weight of firepower no guerrilla army could withstand. It was a war of contact sought and contact won by sheer industrial violence, of body counts and free fire zones, and the heaviest hand in the history of warfare. The Australians, arriving in their own corner of the South, did close to the opposite, and they did it on purpose. Their doctrine, hardened in the jungles of the Malayan emergency and the secret war in Borneo, asked not for the grand sweep, but for the patient footstep. It asked for constant patrolling, for the laying of ambushes, for the slow pursuit of an enemy through country he believed he owned. Whole units would spend long stretches in the bush, doing nothing more dramatic than searching, painstakingly, for the small signs that someone else had passed that way. Combat, when it came, was usually close, and usually over in seconds, a sudden eruption of violence in the green, and then silence again. It was a quieter war, a slower war, and in its own corner of Vietnam it worked. That war was demanding enough on its own. Even where there was no enemy at all, men were maimed and killed by the mines and booby traps the Viet Cong seeded through the country with patient malice, so that the simple act of walking became a test of nerve that frayed a man from the inside. But inside that task force was a far smaller body of men for whom the patience and the closeness and the silence were not one element of the job among many. For them, they were the whole of it. In 1966, the 1st Australian Task Force established itself at a low rubber plantation rise called Nui Dat in Phuoc Toi Province, southeast of Saigon, and from there, the Australians ranged out into Phuoc Toi and into the neighboring provinces of Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Thuy. Much of that country was thick jungle and broken hill, and in its northeastern reaches stood the Nui Me Tao Mountains, a vast tract of green that sat beyond the range of the guns at Nui Dat, and could not be cordoned, could not be cleared, could only be entered. Somebody had to go into that country and come back knowing where the enemy slept, how many he was, and which way he was moving. On a feature the soldiers themselves came to call SAS Hill sat the men who would do exactly that, and before the war was over, they would hold the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam. The enemy who held that country was not the ragged peasant band of popular imagination, and the men who hunted him never made that mistake. Phuoc Tuy was worked by local guerrillas who farmed by day and fought by night, and reinforced by hardened main force Viet Cong, and, in time, by regulars of the North Vietnamese army who had walked for months down the trail from the north and who fought with patience, discipline, and a fieldcraft equal to anything brought against them. He had spent years preparing the ground. He had dug tunnel networks and concealed bunkers whose firing slits were invisible at 10 paces, and he drew his food and his eyes and ears from the villages, so that the line between the population and the enemy was not a line at all, but a smear. You could not simply march out and look for him, because he would see you first. You had to enter his world on his own terms, move as he moved, see as he saw, and be better at it than he was. The man at the front of one of those patrols was the most exposed soldier in the entire Australian order of battle, and he knew it with a clarity that never left him. Consider one of them. Terry O'Farrell enlisted as the war was gathering its momentum, and across 2 tours of Vietnam, he went out on some 40 patrols behind enemy lines, first as a forward scout, then as a signaler, finally as a patrol commander. He was wounded twice. He stayed in the army afterward and rose to the rank of major, and decades later he set down what those patrols had actually been like, because the men who had lived them had learned that almost nobody else could understand. He belonged to a small brotherhood with a particular shape. The Special Air Service Regiment had been raised as a single company in 1957 and expanded into a full regiment in August of 1964. Built at Campbell Barracks in the seaside suburb of Swanbourne in Western Australia, modeled on the British Special Air Service and carrying the same hard, twin-edged motto, "Who dares wins." Its first proving ground had been the secret jungle campaign in Borneo during the confrontation with Indonesia, where small Australian patrols learned to live and fight and survive far beyond any friendly line. In the field, the regiment worked through 3 squadrons, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd, each taking a turn of a year in country before handing over and flying home, a rotation that held from 1966 until the last of them withdrew in October of 1971. A 4th squadron, raised in 1965, was broken up almost at once to reinforce the other 3. Woven into each Australian squadron was a troop of the New Zealand SAS, so that the patrols slipping into the bush were, as often as not, an Anzac affair. Across the whole campaign, only about 580 Australian SAS soldiers served in Vietnam, a remarkably small number for the reputation they earned, and among them they conducted something on the order of 1,175 patrols, with the New Zealanders adding roughly a further 130. Selection was built to break the unsuitable early, a punishing filter of endurance and isolation and sleeplessness meant to find the rare soldier who did not crack when he was tired and frightened and entirely alone. But selection could only deliver a man to the edge of the thing. It could find the temperament, the lungs, the legs, and the nerve. It could not finish him. Only the bush could finish him, slowly, or it killed him. Every man in a patrol of 5 held a trade. There was the commander, who made the decisions that kept them alive. There was the signaler, on whom every chance of rescue depended, hunched over his radio tapping out reports in code. There was a medic, because the nearest hospital might be a day of fighting away. There was a second man, ready to take command the instant the leader fell. And there was the forward scout, walking point, the first man into everything, the patrol's single living sensor pushed out ahead into whatever waited in the green. Everything that could be taught, the Australians taught with an obsessive, almost ritual precision, and the size of the trainable part is what makes the untrainable part so startling. a patrol was inserted, most often by helicopter, dropped by the Hueys of No. 9 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, the aircraft flaring in to disgorge 5 men at treetop height and lift away again within seconds, with gunships circling ready overhead in case the landing zone proved hot. Sometimes the insertion was done by armored personnel carrier, with deception folded into the route, so the noise could not betray where the patrol had slipped off into the trees. Once on the ground, the men lived by what they called hard routine, a discipline that was really a kind of self-erasure. No cooking fires, no hot food, no talking above the barest murmur, and very often no talking at all. Only the patrol's own silent vocabulary of hand signals passed back down the file. They ate cold from the tin and buried or carried out everything they could not eat, leaving nothing for a tracker to find. They moved, when they moved at all, more slowly than any other soldiers in the theater, sometimes only a few meters in an hour, because speed made noise, and noise was death. And they drilled endlessly, the answer to the worst moment of all, the moment of contact. When a patrol was bounced, its reply was a sudden, shocking, wholly disproportionate volume of automatic fire, every weapon opening in the same instant. The point being, as one of the regiment's officers explained it, that immediate heavy fire kept the enemy's head down and created the illusion of a far larger force than the handful of men who were really there. Then the patrol broke contact and ran. Shoot and scoot, open with the fury of a company, and vanish before the enemy could gather his wits and count his attackers. The trainable craft ran deeper still. Navigation was done in silence by map and compass, and the patient counting of paces, because a patrol that did not know exactly where it stood could not call for the guns or the helicopters and would simply disappear. Everything in the end depended on the radio and the man who carried it. A thin thread of signal stretched back to Nui Dot. And rescue, when it was needed, came from the same Hueys that had put them in. Many of the extractions were what the men called hard, carried out under fire, the helicopter dropping into a clearing while the gunships hammered the tree line, or, where there was no clearing, the crew lowering ropes through the canopy to winch the patrol out bodily into the air. All of this could be written down. All of this could be drilled on a range in Western Australia until it lived in the muscle. And none of it, in the end, was the thing that kept these men alive. It began, the men said, with the birds. Picture an ordinary afternoon on patrol, somewhere in the close green of Phuoc Tui, the heat sitting on the canopy like a flat hand. The forward scout is moving at the pace of a clock's minute hand, placing each boot with deliberation, reading the ground in front of him the way a literate man reads a page, and the forest around him is loud with its ordinary, careless life. Then a single register of that life changes. The insects nearest him fall quiet. A bird that had been calling does not call again. To almost anyone else it would be nothing, a coincidence of the wild, beneath notice. To him, it is a sentence in a language he has spent 1 year and 100 patrols learning to read, and the sentence says that something has entered the forest ahead of him, and that every small living thing between him and it has gone still to make room for it. He stops. Behind him, without a word spoken and without a signal yet given, the whole patrol stops too, because they have learned, in their bodies, to stop when he stops, an instant before any of them knows why. What he does next is the eerie thing, the practice at the very heart of this story, and it has almost nothing to do with the eyes. He reads the wind. The enemy he is hunting lives on rice and fish, and the fermented fish sauce called nuoc mam, cooks his meals over small wood fires, and carries on his clothing and his skin The particular compound smell of that diet and that smoke, a scent as distinct to a nose that has learned it as a fingerprint. The Australian smells of ration meat and soap and the chemical tang of his own equipment, which is exactly why the SAS waged a quiet, fastidious war upon their own scent, giving up soap and tobacco and anything perfumed, scrubbing themselves down to as close to nothing as a man can be, because a man who can be smelled can be found, and a man who can be found can be killed. So the scout stands in the new silence with his nostrils flaring, sorting the air. Wood smoke where no wood smoke should be, the faint sourness of fish on a shift of breeze. A human note threaded through a forest that a heartbeat ago had smelled only of itself, of leaf rot and damp earth and green. It was not a sixth sense. There was nothing supernatural in it. It was 1,000 patrols worth of tiny observations compressed into a single half-second of recognition, the kind of knowledge that lives below conscious thought, down in the body, and gives its verdict before the mind has finished framing the question. No drill could ever install it, because it was not information that could be handed over. It was experience worn so deep that it had turned into instinct. The eyes had their own version of the same hard literacy, as old as hunting itself. It was tracking, the reading of sign, and the scout practiced it with every step. A footprint told him not only that a man had passed, but by the crispness or the crumbling of its edges, by the litter fallen into it. Since, roughly when. A blade of grass bent and not yet sprung back, pointed the way someone had gone. He read bruised foliage, the paler underside of a leaf turned over by a careless boot, mud smeared onto the top of a log, where a dry crossing should have left none. The single thread of a spider's web broken across a trail at chest height, meaning a man had passed since it was spun at first light. None of it was magic. All of it was attention, trained until it ran on its own, the patient sorting of 1,000 meaningless details to find the one that was not. The stakes riding on that instinct were total because of a cruel arithmetic peculiar to that jungle. A scout who caught sight of an enemy soldier at 15 meters through the foliage had, in that glimpse, learned almost nothing. The man might be alone, a straggler easily dealt with. He might be the forward scout of an enemy platoon moving up behind him. Or, worst of all, he might be a sentry over a concealed bunker system whose camouflaged weapon pits lay as yet unseen, perhaps 10 meters off the patrol's own flank. The enemy holding his fire, with the iron discipline he so often had, until the Australians had walked all the way into the lanes of his machine guns. The glimpse told you nothing. The silence and the smell and the feel of the ground told you everything, if and only if you could read them. And the gap between a man who could read them and a man who could not was the whole gap between springing the trap and dying in one. This was not a task a soldier performed. It was a state he inhabited, and the men who lived it gave it a name of plain, exhausted poetry. They called it sleeping with your ears open. You never fully rested. Every sense stayed switched on for the length of a patrol, days on end, sometimes weeks on end. A wakefulness no later leave ever quite undid, and it was the true and lasting price of the gift. The cruelest irony of the whole business sat in a workshop a long way from the bush. The Americans, facing the same maddening problem of an enemy who would not be seen, reached for the answer their way of war reached for in every difficulty: a machine. They built an electronic personnel detector, mounted it in helicopters, and flew it low over the canopy to do by chemistry what the scout did by instinct: to sniff the moving air for the trace of massed human bodies hidden below. The Australians used the device too. a staff sergeant of the task force intelligence staff, a man named Wayne Wells, worked one of these airborne sniffers, an instrument built quite literally to smell the enemy out of the jungle. And the enemy, who had learned so much else, learned this as well. He hung buckets of mud and urine in the trees to give the machine its readings, where no soldiers were. He used soap and chili and garlic to throw the scent off the trail. The expensive, ingenious instrument could be fooled by a peasant with a bucket and a handful of spice. The thing in the scout's chest could not be fooled so easily, because it was never reading a single chemical in isolation, but a whole world at once. The silence and the smoke and the sour note and the indefinable wrongness, all of it taken in together and weighed in an instant, the way only a living animal that has survived can read the country it has survived in. In the beginning, though, before the instinct had set, the bush did its teaching the hard way, the only way it knew. 3rd Squadron was the first of the 3 to go, arriving across 1966, and the regiment drew its first enemy blood in May of that year in the country around Nui Dat, an encounter that ended very badly for the Viet Cong, who blundered into the path of men they had not known were there. But the jungle collected its debts early, and it collected them from both sides. On the 18th of January, 1967, an SAS patrol fought a sharp action against a large enemy group and had to be extracted under fire, one of its men badly wounded. He was flown home to Australia for treatment, and there, of complications, he died. An early and bitter entry on a casualty list that would stay mercifully short across the whole war and would never once feel short to the men who knew the names on it. Weeks later, on the 2nd of March, 1967, the main body of 1st Squadron arrived at Nui Dat to relieve the 3rd. They mounted their first operation on the 8th, patrolled for 5 days through empty country without sighting a soul, and then, on the 20th of March, came suddenly upon a group of perhaps 10 Viet Cong, one of whom they killed before the rest melted away. So it went, patrol after patrol, the slow accumulation of contacts and near misses, the squadron ranging north of the village of Bien Ba and through the Nui Thi Vai and Nui Din hills, until by that first winter it was operating across the whole sprawl of Puoc Tui. In September, it took part in Operation Santa Fe, a combined Australian, American, and South Vietnamese push against the Viet Cong stronghold in the Nui Mae Tao Mountains, the kind of large operation the small patrols existed to make possible, feeding back the patient intelligence that told the heavier forces where to go. On paper, and in the minds of the men who first conceived their role, the SAS were watchers, the eyes and ears of the task force, and nothing more, sent out to see and to report and to come home unnoticed. In 1968, that began to change, when the 2nd Squadron arrived in February of that year to relieve the 1st, conducting its first patrol on the 5th of March and accumulating 29 patrols by the end of that single month. It found that the appetite at headquarters had shifted beneath it. The commander of the task force wanted the SAS turned outward. Their efforts swung from quiet observation toward open attack. The man who captured the change most plainly was Brigadier Ron Hughes, who led the task force from late in 1967 into late in 1968, and who said afterward, with a candor that has not aged comfortably, that the kill rate the SAS achieved had been very gratifying to him, and that he had never really regarded them as an intelligence-gathering organization at all, but rather as a force to be loosed against intelligence that other means had already gathered. So the reconnaissance patrol grew a harder edge. 2 patrols of 5 would combine into a single fighting patrol of 10, and the men who had spent their tours learning to read where the enemy walked now turned that reading to a new purpose, choosing the ground where the enemy would die. They laid their ambushes along the very trails their instinct told them would be used, and waited in the killing ground, with the patience that was the truest and least teachable mark of the trade. They carried the tools of close and sudden violence, the light American rifle fitted with a modified flash suppressor so the muzzle would not flare and betray the firing position, and a grenade launcher slung beneath it to throw a shattering blast into the first instant of a contact. Through operations like Coburg in 1968, the squadrons built a reputation as the deadliest small unit in the entire Australian force, earned a handful of men at a time, in the green, in silence, and then in a sudden roar. Not every patrol that went out to make contact went out to kill. Some of the boldest operations the regiment mounted were snatch patrols, sent into the enemy's own territory, not to ambush a passing column, but to seize a single living man and carry him out for questioning, because a captured soldier who could be made to talk was worth more than any number of bodies left on a trail. To take a prisoner alive in country the enemy owned, to overpower him in silence before he could raise the alarm, and then to move him, unwilling and dangerous, back through the bush to a landing zone while his comrades came looking for him, asked a composure that is hard to imagine. It was the reconnaissance instinct turned to its most audacious purpose, the hunters reaching into the lion's mouth to take a tooth and walking out with it. The turn toward killing came in the very year the war swung on its hinge. At the end of January 1968, the enemy threw off all pretense of patient guerrilla struggle and launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated wave of assaults on cities and bases the length of South Vietnam. And though it cost him terribly in men, it shattered for good the official story that the war was being quietly won. In Phuoc Tuy, the task force was pulled into harder and more frequent fighting, and the tempo of the SAS rose with it. And with the rising tally of enemy dead came a quiet unease that some in the regiment felt, and few spoke aloud. The sense that the count itself was becoming the measure of the thing, that a force built to see was being judged on how many it could kill. What the Australians could not know in those confident middle years was that the enemy was studying them just as closely as they studied him. An instinct cannot be stolen, but a technique can always be learned, and by the turn of the decade, the Viet Cong had learned the techniques. When the first squadron returned for its second tour in February of 1970, it came back to a province that had quietly changed beneath it. Enemy activity across Phuoc Tuy was ebbing, and many patrols now went out for days, for weeks, sometimes for months, and saw nothing at all, a grinding frustration that wore on men trained to a fine edge and then given nothing to cut. Worse, the enemy had finally cracked the rhythm of the SAS insertions. From June of 1970, it was no longer unusual for a patrol to be fired upon within minutes of its helicopter touching the ground, because the enemy had learned to listen for the beat of the Hueys and to move at once toward the few clearings where a patrol might be set down. Here lies the deepest truth in this whole story, the single idea worth carrying away from it. Every trainable trick the SAS possessed could, in the end, be decoded by an enemy as intelligent and adaptable as they were themselves. The insertion drills, the contact drills, the patterns of movement and the choice of ground, all of it could be watched over time, studied, and countered. The only thing that could not be countered, because it could not be predicted and could not even be fully put into words, was the instinct living in the forward scout, the unteachable reading of silence and scent and disturbed earth that stayed 1/2 second ahead of an enemy who had matched the Australians at very nearly everything that could be matched. A trick can be taught, and what can be taught to one man can be learned by another, and so a trick can always be beaten. Instinct cannot be taught, and so it can never be stolen, and so it can never be beaten in advance. That, stripped of everything else, was the whole of the regiment's edge, and against it the enemy, for all his cunning, could finally do nothing. The Australian answer to the betrayed insertions was itself a kind of trick, clever and faintly absurd, and like all tricks, it bought time rather than safety. They called it the cowboy insertion. The helicopter carrying the real patrol would be followed in by a second helicopter carrying a second patrol, and both would land, and both patrols would move off together through the bush for 5 minutes. Then the decoy patrol would stop, wait, and turn back toward the landing zone to be lifted out, while the real patrol carried on alone, deeper into the country, its true point of departure now hidden inside the noise and confusion of 2 landings instead of 1. It worked for a while, in the way such things work, until the enemy adapted again, because every counter breeds its own counter, and the game has no final move. And underneath all the cleverness lay the thing no cowboy insertion could ever replace, the same thing it had always been, the man at the front of the file who would know, by a means he could not have explained to you if his life depended on it, exactly when to stop. To understand what every silent hour was actually for, watch an ambush come together. Not one ambush on one named day, for the surviving accounts of so many of them blur into a single shared memory of how the thing was done. But the anatomy of it, as the men who lived it, set it down. A patrol has chosen its ground. A stretch of trail the scouts' reading of the whole country sees will be walked. The men ease into the vegetation along the killing side of it and become part of the forest. Hours pass. The discipline this demands is not the familiar discipline of action, but its far harder cousin, the discipline of absolute stillness, of lying without the smallest movement, while ants find the skin and the heat presses down, and a cramp begins to scream in the muscle of a calf, and nothing at all, is permitted to show. And then, at last, the forest tells them. The insects nearest the trail go quiet. On the slow breeze comes the wood smoke and the thin, sour thread of fish that means men, and not their own men. The scout's hand lifts, a single finger raised, the only thing in the entire position that moves. Down the trail, unhurried, unknowing, come the figures they have waited all those hours for, and there opens a stretched and almost unbearable instant in which the whole patrol holds, every eye fixed on the lead man's hand, every weapon already laid and ready. The world shrunk to the size of a single-held breath. Then the breath releases, and the world comes apart. The first weapon opens, and every other follows inside the same half-second. The disproportionate fury they had drilled 10,000 times on a range on the far side of the world. The sound of a company torn from the throats of a handful of men. And almost as suddenly as it began, it is ending. The patrol already up and moving, already melting backward into the green, gone before the survivors on the trail can begin to understand what has struck them, or from how many guns, or how very few men were holding them. That was the payoff. That was the violent, sudden flowering of every scentless, soundless, sleepless hour that had gone before it. But springing the trap was only half of surviving it, because a patrol of 10 men who had just announced themselves in the heart of enemy country now had to get out before the country closed on them. The same instinct that chose the ground had already chosen the way off it, the route to the clearing where the helicopters would come, and the patrol ran for it, while the enemy, recovering, gathered behind them. This was the moment the partnership with the air crews was made for. The Hueys came in low and fast over hostile ground, the gunships raking the tree line to hold the enemy down, the patrol breaking from cover to scramble aboard as rounds came up at the aircraft, and then the lurch and the lift and the green falling away below. Those were the longest seconds a man could live, and when it worked, The patrol that had been the most pursued quarry in the country a minute before was suddenly, impossibly, safe, and the silence of the cabin after the roar of the contact was a thing the survivors never forgot. The gift, though, was never free, and the bill for it came due in two separate currencies. The lighter of the two, and the more visible, was blood, and mercifully the regiment spent very little of it. Across the entire campaign, the SAS lost, by the most commonly cited reckoning, only one man killed in action by enemy fire, with a small handful of others lost to wounds, to accident, to illness, and to one soldier who went missing, and somewhere around 28 wounded, though the precise tallies differ a little from one honest account to the next. Measured against more than 1,000 patrols pushed deep into ground the enemy believed was entirely his own, it is an almost unbelievable record, and it is the surest proof there is that the craft was real. But there was a second and far heavier currency, and it never appeared on any casualty return because it had no name the Army recognized. It was the long cost of sleeping with your ears open, paid out slowly, across decades, by men who came home and found they could not switch the alertness off, who had spent the most formative seasons of their young lives as the most hunted and the most hunting creatures in a forest that punished the smallest lapse of attention with death, and who carried that permanent vigilance back to a suburban country that had no idea where they had been or what it had asked of them. The danger had been without pause, and the burden of it lay on the mind as much as the body, and many a man who never took a wound was marked for the rest of his life all the same. By the very end, even the watching was running out. On the 4th of February, 1971, a New Zealand patrol killed 2 enemy northwest of a place called Tua Tich, and that, after 5 years, was the last contact, the final small and violent full stop on the regiment's war. The 1st Squadron flew home a fortnight afterward, on the 18th of February, and the 2nd Squadron, the last of the 3 still in country, withdrew from Vietnam altogether in October of 1971, and with that, the phantoms left the jungle for good. Set the whole ledger out plainly, and it is hard to credit. Well over 1,000 patrols, each one pushed into ground the enemy believed was his alone. A ratio of enemy, dead to men, lost that no other Australian unit of the war came near. In the 1st Squadron's first tour alone, 246 patrols mounted, and 83 Viet Cong confirmed killed, with a further 15 recorded as probable. And set against the whole of that, against 5 years of deliberately seeking the most dangerous work in the theater, the regiment brought very nearly every one of its men home alive. The arithmetic is not a boast. It is the plainest possible proof of the craft. Men who went unseen did not die, and men who could truly read the bush went unseen. The two facts are the same fact, stated twice. The legend that grew up afterward, and grows still, says these men possessed a 6th sense, something psychic, something close to magic in the deep forest. The truth is stranger and far harder won, and it is worth taking the trouble to set it straight, because the truth honors them more completely than the myth ever could. There was nothing supernatural in any of it. What looked from the outside like magic was in fact the most human thing imaginable. An animal awareness slowly rebuilt inside a modern soldier by relentless and dangerous exposure. A whole bundle of concrete, individually unremarkable, entirely learnable observations. The silence of insects, the carry of wood smoke, the angle of a single bent stem, the age of a footprint, the indefinable wrongness in a familiar pattern, all of them fused together by experience into something that fired faster and more reliably than conscious thought ever could. To call that a sixth sense is almost to insult the years of cold rations and sleepless nights and accumulated terror that built it. The men of the regiment, in fact, were frequently suspicious of the glamour that attached itself to them. When the 3rd Squadron returned for its second tour in 1969 and threw its weight back into pure reconnaissance in the Mae Tao Mountains, work whose worth was proved beyond argument, when the intelligence it gathered let a full battalion mount a clearing operation a month long that December, its commander, Major Reginald Beasley, did something quietly and permanently telling. Earlier squadrons had kept what were called kills boards, running tallies of enemy dead chalked up like the score of a football match, the natural offspring of a philosophy that prized the kill rate above all other measures. Beasley kicked them down. To his mind, the purpose of the regiment was to see and not to score, and the boards were a vanity that mistook the body count for the mission. It captured a quiet argument the regiment was having with itself about what it was truly for, an argument that stands now as a useful corrective in an age when this whole story is most often told by breathless, dramatized videos and even by wholly invented narratives, complete with fictional American colonels who never drew breath, all of them reaching for a magic that was never there when the plain documented reality was always more impressive than any embroidery laid over it. The truth had to wait a long time to be told, and that delay is part of the story too. The regiment's first war in Borneo had been an outright secret, fought and finished before the Australian public was told it had happened at all, and the habit of silence carried forward. Much of what the SAS did in Vietnam was classified, discussed only within the regiment, and the men themselves were not given to talking, schooled by their trade into a reticence that outlasted the war by decades. They came home, moreover, to a country that had turned against the conflict, where returning soldiers were too often met, not with parades, but with indifference or hostility. So the phantoms, who had been invisible to the enemy by design, became very nearly invisible at home by neglect, their record locked in patrol reports and carried in the memories of a few hundred men, until the historians and the veterans themselves at last began to set it down. The enemy gave them the name that outlived the war, and a name is its own kind of monument. Ma Rung, the phantoms, the ghosts of the jungle, a phrase that has survived precisely because it captured a genuine and particular terror, the dread of an opponent you could not hear approach and could not find once he had gone, who seemed to rise out of the ground and sink back into it. That reputation became an inheritance, and it was passed on. The Australians proved good enough at their trade that they helped to teach it onward, and the patrol courses the regiment runs to this day descend in an unbroken line from that bloody apprenticeship in Borneo and Vietnam. The respect was not the enemy's alone. The Americans, who had come to the war with the largest and best-equipped army on Earth, sent their own long-range reconnaissance men from the 101st Airborne Division out on patrol alongside the Australians to learn how the thing was done, and the regiment in turn helped shape the schooling through which the United States tried to grow a jungle reconnaissance tradition of its own. It was a quiet compliment, paid one professional soldier to another, and a measure of how completely a few hundred men had mastered the most difficult kind of soldiering there is. The men themselves, in their own time, set down what the dry records never could, in the books that now form the backbone of the regiment's living memory, the official history that took the Phantom's own enemy, given name for its title, the veteran's account that called itself, with perfect and bleak economy, by the very phrase the men had lived inside, sleeping with your ears open, and the forward scout's own unsparing memoir of 2 tours behind the enemy's lines. And underneath all the remembrance, the practical inheritance endured. The reconnaissance soul of the regiment, The unfashionable conviction that the most valuable soldier on any battlefield is not the one who makes the most noise, but the one who sees the most without being seen, was forged in that jungle, and it never left. There is a sound the jungle makes when it is safe, and there is the silence that falls upon it when it is not. And somewhere in the green of Phuoc Tue, more than half a century gone now, a man walked down a trail into that silence without ever knowing it had already closed around him. What decided his fate in the next half-second was not a weapon, and not a machine, and not anything written in any manual, in any army anywhere in the world. It was 1,000 patrols compressed into one stranger's instinct. The single skill the Australian army could never issue to a man, and could only hope the bush would grant him in time, the unteachable reading of silence and smoke and disturbed ground. That is the real distance this story has been measuring all along. The distance between everything a drill could teach, which was a great deal, and which a clever and patient enemy could in the end match and counter and beat, and the one thing a drill could not teach at all, which could be matched by no one, and which decided, again and again, who walked out of the forest and who did not. The men who carried that instinct paid for it with years of rest they never got back, and a few of them paid with everything they had, and the country they served kept so much of what they did a secret for so long that most Australians never knew the phantoms had been among them. They are nearly all gone now, the men who could read a living forest the way the rest of us read a road sign, and the strange and priceless thing they knew is quietly going with them. If you believe they deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand the war the cameras never showed you, watch this next